Welcome to Sharp Insights, Conversations with Your Plan Giving Experts, a podcast for development professionals. Whether you're new to the field or looking to enhance your existing program, we will provide practical tips, expert advice, and real-world stories to deepen your understanding of plan giving. If you're committed to securing long-term support for your nonprofit, you've come to the right place.
Welcome to Sharp Insights, Conversations with Your Plan Giving Experts. I'm your host, Grant Miller. In today's episode, we focus on the ever-evolving relationship between nonprofits and Capitol Hill. What are lawmakers in Washington focusing on related to charities and fundraising? What's next? And what might it all mean for your organization? I'm joined today by Ali Bedford. Ali is the Senior Vice President at Integer, where she assists nonprofits and mission-driven organizations in navigating policy and safeguarding their interests in Washington. Named a top lobbyist in 2025, Ali has extensive experience in advocacy, coalition building, and tax policy. Ali, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Awesome. Well, let's just start with the big picture. How would you describe the current attitude toward nonprofits in Washington right now?
So that's certainly a mixed bag at the moment. I like to try to keep things glass half full, but have to acknowledge that where we are right now in DC with the sentiment on nonprofits from lawmakers and from the administration is certainly a mix of appreciation, but unfortunately skepticism as well. One theme we've seen over the years, not really new, but really heightened over the last several years, is that while the nonprofit sector is widely valued, especially by some lawmakers and some folks here in DC, it's also really misunderstood, especially in the policy discussions and by lawmakers who are crafting policy. So kind of that mixed bag there, really, in my mind, a lot of misunderstanding and a lot of lack of education about the sector, and certainly about kind of that critical role the sector plays in filling gaps, supporting communities, delivering services, but also more critical eye on whether some organizations are engaging in activity or in some cases just not politically favored. And so we're seeing some lawmakers take a closer look at that as well.
And so the skepticism, would you say it's mostly, like, say, maybe political, aimed at certain organizations who aren't in line with the administration's ideologies or something? Where does some of this skepticism come from? And, you mentioned undereducation. So I just wonder if you could speak to that a little bit and talk about what the issue is there and how that maybe can be remedied at all.
Yeah, so there is certainly, and this is not news to anyone, if you see the news, there is certainly some skepticism about different types of activities by nonprofits, some of which we're seeing lawmakers right now really focused on what they're viewing as illegal activities. I think we can all say, or at least from my perspective, we don't want bad actors in the nonprofit field spoiling the well for those that are doing great work. So if there are nonprofit organizations that are operating in illegal ways, then certainly think the IRS should be looking into that. But at the same time, we shouldn't be picking winners and losers, at least from my perspective, within mission areas of the sector, within work of nonprofit organizations. And that's kind of a topic that we've seen really in the last several years as it comes to kind of that ideological lens, which really can complicate the conversation, right? Because you're seeing it from both sides of the aisle. You're seeing it from lawmakers who sit on the right as well as lawmakers who sit on the left. And that's certainly not something we want based on missions or the work that's being done, but certainly also want to make sure that if there are folks who, or organizations who are not operating under the letter of the law for their tax exempt status, that they're not putting a bad taste in folks' mouth for the entire charitable sector, which is largely, in my mind, doing really great work around the country.
Well, from your perspective, is that a pretty systematic, widespread issue for nonprofits to behave poorly?
I would say no. I would say largely with nonprofits I work with and with my clients, they're all doing really great work. The nonprofit sector is one of the most transparent sectors. Nonprofits have to comply by a lot of different rules and regulations. And so I would say largely the sentiment about nonprofits is that they are doing good work and they are tax exempt for a reason. And I think lawmakers believe that too. We saw that as they continue to encourage charitable giving and deductions for charitable giving. And so I think it's just making sure, or lawmakers are wanting to make sure that any bad actors are weeded out, if you will. But I choose to believe that the sentiment about the nonprofit sector is largely positive, and there's just been an increased eye to ensure that the entire sector more broadly is operating efficiently and effectively.
It's definitely important to keep that glass half full perspective. I can certainly appreciate that. You mentioned the positives and the negatives here. Are there any notable issues, either positive or negative, that stand out for nonprofits and their connections with lawmakers?
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't think I need to belabor the negative. I think we've talked about maybe the need for more education on Capitol Hill, especially as we see new lawmakers and new staff kind of come in and out of Capitol Hill and the offices in DC. But I think the big positive here for me is that while we do see a more critical eye up here in DC on the nonprofit sector, there is still continued bipartisan support for the nonprofit sector and for encouraging charitable giving incentives and for recognizing nonprofits as essential partners. And so while we see some that want to just make sure that there are no bad actors, we still have a large bench of supporters who really understand the work of nonprofits and understand how critical it is to their communities and to their constituents. And so that to me just indicates this is not lost. We aren't completely lost here in the sentiments on Capitol Hill, but just maybe need to do a bit more education and maybe back to the basics for some of these folks that might be new to DC or new to this policy work and not understand how some of their policies or even investigations into the sector can be harmful to the broader nature of civil society.
Thanks. Back to this idea of increased scrutiny for certain types of nonprofits. How should nonprofits themselves interpret this, or what should their perspective on this be if they think that they might be under more intense scrutiny, either because of their mission or the way that they're handling the books? Is it a crisis for these organizations, or are there opportunities here? What's your perspective on that?
I certainly think there's opportunities. The one thing about DC is things move slowly here as it comes to legislating. And we just saw a lot of legislating happen in 2025 with the passage of a big tax bill. And so now we're kind of in this lane as we're kind of past Q1 of 2026, which is crazy, where lawmakers are looking at how they can legislate large packages, but they're also using this time to investigate. And so I do think that we're going to continue to see lawmakers investigate, which is likely going to include continued hearings on different aspects of the nonprofit sector or tax-exempt organizations. But with any of this critique or crisis, if you will, which I try not to say we're in crisis mode just yet, because I still think there's a lot of opportunity here. And that opportunity really is to change the narrative. I'm going to sound like a broken record, I feel like today, in just saying that the education, the telling the real world story, and nonprofits making sure that their lawmakers really understand the work that's being done and how, if applicable, different policy decisions could impact that. But sometimes it's just as simple as telling that story, humanizing the impact that nonprofits are having in communities, and really explaining what would be lost if there wasn't a nonprofit sector, if nonprofits weren't tax exempt and didn't have the ability to put their revenue back into their missions and back into communities. And so I think there's a huge opportunity here to tell that story, to change the narrative, and to kind of get back to where we were a decade plus ago, which was everyone understanding that the nonprofit sector is a trusted partner to government and really filling in the gaps where government can't or shouldn't in some places. And I think there's a big opportunity to continue that work now and into the future and really change that narrative and get back to that core belief and principle without thinking that there are constant bad actors trying to scam the system.
Right. I like this idea of talking about the narrative and changing the narrative, because I feel like it's a sort of a fundamental thing that, we could all do if we share our stories and our intentions. I think that's a
Absolutely.
good way to move forward. And I do appreciate the word crisis, once you start saying crisis, it kind of puts people in crisis mode. So, I really do like that idea. I think it's important to not view this as a crisis. But, and anytime I always tell my 8-year-old son, I'm like, a problem that you're having is an opportunity.
Right?
So if everybody can just keep the fundamentals, I think, in mind.
Absolutely.
Speaking of legislation, I have written about and done podcasts about and looked at the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, and I'm still kind of wrapping my head around it. I'm not a lawyer, I'm a writer, so I do have a little bit more of an impasse, I think, than lots of folks. But the OB3, I believe that we're calling it on the Hill, it's expected to reshape the landscape of giving in general. And can you just speak to that and tell us how and maybe how organizations can prepare for this shift or opportunity?
How many times are we going to say opportunity in
I
this
think we should
podcast?
say it. Yeah, I think we should keep saying it, and maybe we'll
I
change
think
the
so too.
title. Yeah.
I think so too. But yes, there are a lot of opportunities for a shift in donor behavior, and the One Big Beautiful Bill or the Working Families Tax Cut. There's so many names for it these days. But also prefacing, not a lawyer, but I've spent a lot of time reading the tax code for this. And the big thing I keep coming back to is we are going to see a shift in donor behavior, whether that's for the better or in some cases could be slightly for the worse. So, on the one hand, we have now a permanent charitable deduction for non-itemizers, sometimes also referred to as a universal charitable deduction, which, just means all donors can claim a portion of their gifts to charity, regardless of how they file their taxes. This to me is a great thing. Not just saying that because I've personally worked on this for almost a decade, but I know it's something the nonprofit sector has worked on for many, many years. And my hope with this democratization of the charitable deduction is that we're going to see an increase in not just the number of households participating in civil society and in philanthropy by giving, but also a new potential tradition of giving with younger generations. We've seen a continued drop off in the number of households participating. And my hope with this is that we're really going to turn the tides here and start to see more and more people, especially younger donors, participating, which I think is really great for the health of the sector for years to come. There was actually a recent Lilly Family School of Philanthropy study out of Indiana University that said we could see anywhere from an increase of 6 to 8 million donors because of this provision, which I think is fabulous. On the flip side, the One Big Beautiful Bill did also include some limitations, which are likely to impact donor behavior. There are two in particular that come to mind for me. One directly impacts the charitable deduction as it institutes a 0.5% floor on itemized charitable deductions. So what this means is that taxpayers who itemize are only able to deduct contributions to charity that exceed 0.5% of their adjusted gross income or total income. So, quick example, because I know some of this tax policy wonkiness can be confusing, but a really simple example is a taxpayer's AGI is 200,000. The first 1,000 they give to charity wouldn't qualify for the deduction at all. So, might not sound like a big deal. But in reality, as I think about donor behavior, I think as we make charitable giving and giving away money more expensive, we're going to see that shift donor behavior. And I think this could really impact middle income donors, obviously higher net worth individuals as well. But I think we're going to see some of those middle income donors look to bunch their giving. So, really thinking about whether they're going to be able to give every year to get over that limitation, or if they're going to have to consolidate 1 or 2 years worth of giving and give the following year. And so that could obviously impact nonprofits because they might see kind of spikes, peaks and valleys in the money that they're bringing in. I think we could also see some donors look to use donor advised funds more because of this. So that way they can give money into their DAF and then use that to strategically give throughout the year, especially if there's a year where they might not be able to give to overcome that limitation. The second one I just want to note here is just a broad new cap on itemized deductions broadly. So this obviously will impact charitable giving as it limits the value of itemized deductions for those in the top tax bracket. And so this is where we're going to see the larger donors, the more high net worth individuals, we could see them shift their giving behavior because it's making it more expensive for them to give. And they're essentially, instead of getting a 37% tax benefit for every dollar given to charity, they're now only going to be able to get a 35% tax benefit. So it just makes giving more expensive. I think there's still a lot to learn about how exactly these limitations are going to impact donor behavior. But I think the sentiment right now is that we are likely to see some type of impact that could cause steady streams of giving that nonprofits might be used to have some bumps in the road as we learn kind of how donors are going to navigate these new limitations. So sorry, I just gave you a ton of tax policy jargon there, but hopefully that made sense.
No, that's good. I mean, I think the big takeaway is that we don't have a crystal ball, right?
Yeah.
And we're just kind of waiting and watching. And it's not a crisis, it's a moment of opportunity.
Absolutely.
I'm not sure if this is in your wheelhouse, but I'm just curious. You mentioned about the seeing more younger donors giving, in recent times and in the future. I've noticed, in my life, a lot of people who I know, since, organizations they care about, they're getting federal funding cut and these sorts of things, and they're kind of stepping in to fund PBS or whatever it might be. Mm-hmm. Is that cause of that trend, or does it have something to do with the great wealth transfer, or do you know? Or
I'm not quite sure. I can't give you a sound full answer on exactly why that might be. My personal opinion on it is, without any data to back it up, is that I do think with the great wealth transfer, with some of these hits at mission areas or different types of organizations and how we're seeing donors step up to provide funding to them if their funding was cut because of executive orders up here in DC or the like, I do think that could be a generational shift or, a shift in donors. But I think we don't have enough to say that for certain right now. Mm-hmm. I do think that the younger generations are still very altruistic, still very charitable. They're just doing it in different ways, some of which can be non-traditional ways. And so it's hard for us to capture that in data when, things like GoFundMe or even just, helping a friend by giving them money for a startup or whatever it might be, those aren't necessarily traditional charitable vehicles or considered traditional charitable donations. And so I think they're doing things differently. And I'm curious to see if we're going to see those donors and even new donors coming up continue to do that, but also participate in kind of what we think of as more traditional charitable giving avenues and vehicles.
All right. Thanks for your perspective on that. I appreciate that. Back to legislation. Are there any other, recent or any legislation in the works that could also really impact, nonprofit organizations and their plan giving programs or overall operation?
Yes, there certainly are. So there have been a variety of proposals that have either are still in proposal phase or some that we've actually seen legislation introduced to do that are definitely going to impact planned giving programs, but also just impact giving in general and nonprofits that receive the gifts. So one piece of legislation has to do with qualified charitable distributions out of retirement accounts. And so we know that there's a proposal that we're likely to see introduced, hopefully in the coming weeks to months, that would allow retirement savers to give to charity directly from their 401k instead of first having to roll it into an IRA. And so that obviously would unlock a different pool or a different ability for retirement savers to give to charity that obviously would allow them to do it quicker and without as much of the red tape. Sticking with that and the qualified charitable, there is currently a bill that would unlock the QCD for gifts into donor advised funds. which is currently not applicable. And so we could see that also unlock another avenue and another way for retirees to give to charity. On the flip side, we are likely to see some proposals or talks or discussion perhaps around whether or not there need to be additional reforms or reining in of certain charitable giving vehicles like donor advised funds. I think that as we learn more and see more about donor behavior as it relates to the tax bill that passed last year and those limitations we just talked about, we could see an increase in the use of donor advised funds, which is likely going to point some critics and lawmakers to consider whether or not the giving vehicle needs to be looked at closer or have additional guardrails. So that could be either legislatively, or there's also a regulatory component to donor advised funds with the Treasury Department right now, where we could see them try to similarly maybe tighten or put some additional parameters in place as it relates to the use of donor advised funds. So I think there's opportunities here, especially in the retirement area as it relates to legislation, but certainly going to be watching for legislation that could negatively impact donors' ability to use various giving vehicles or platforms.
Okay, so we might see some more changes coming down the pike. I'm just curious, back to this scrutiny for different organizations. I know a lot of organizations, part of their whole strategy takes place in Washington quite a bit, and it's just part of how they operate. What about organizations who maybe have always been a little bit under the radar and have not felt the need to advocate in Washington? Like, how can these organizations, I guess, establish a voice in Washington?
I always say start small. You can start small, you can start local. I think there is a lot of hesitancy, especially for smaller or newer organizations who haven't done this work or don't have experience coming to Capitol Hill and talking with lawmakers and staff. They don't know where to start. And really, you don't have to come to DC right away. You can start small by just getting to know your local, either state representation, but your federal lawmakers also have offices in the district and they have staff in the district, and they are more than happy to meet with you at home where you are for you to share your story, share how you're impacting the community. Again, going back to what we talked about earlier, really relating it back to that real world impact that your organization is having and doing in that district. I always just say start small, invite folks to come to where you are if you are having an event or if you are a nonprofit that might be able to show them the work that you're doing firsthand. And that'll help lead you and get you more comfortable to that relationship building with those offices. So when you are ready to come to DC, you feel like you're not completely out of water. But there's also other ways too for especially smaller organizations to get involved. And, you can join coalitions, lend your voice to an effort that's already underway. There are a number of coalitions that are based in DC that have voices and folks that join Zooms or calls to talk about the impacts and to share how they're kind of elevating those stories with lawmakers on Capitol Hill. And then there's a number of different philanthropy serving organizations that are national and regional based that you can join or participate in their fly-ins where they come to DC or hold district events back in the district with lawmakers to share your story. And so for me, I say start small. It can be as simple as connecting with the district office, asking for a meeting, sharing your story, or even offering your story to an organization that you know is coming up to DC and can, help to carry your message. So I think there's a number of different ways, but it doesn't have to be flying up to DC once a month. Although we welcome you with open arms if you can and choose to do that as well.
Okay, good. That's helpful. A lot of good resources there. I appreciate that. Zooming out a little bit, this is a somewhat abstract question, but we don't know what we don't know in general. And I'm just curious, are there any issues you've seen that are maybe kind of blindsiding nonprofits that they weren't, paying attention to or looking out for that we should be aware of?
I'm pausing because blindsiding nonprofits right now, I think is a bit hard to do, but I also recognize that I sit here in DC. And so I think perhaps I am just consumed with what's coming out of the administration and Congress more. I think largely it really is understanding that while we're not in crisis, we are in a moment where the nonprofit sector as a whole is being looked at with a very critical eye. And with that, we can see policymakers try to craft fixes, if you will, and I put that in air quotations, but try to do things that they think are going to help, but with unintended consequences and with just a lack of understanding of how the sector works and how certain policies are going to impact it. And so I think right now it's mostly just staying close to the work. And if you can, continue to build relationships with your lawmakers' offices so that when these types of conversations, whether that's just a discussion or a hearing or actual policy being introduced, that you have a seat at the table. Because right now, I think that's the most important thing. And that's what I've been hearing from lawmakers' offices is not that they're not willing to work with us as a sector, but more so we need to make sure that we're there to tell our story and explain why this would or would not work and what the impacts are. And so I'm not sure if it's a blind side as much of a kind of staying vigilant right now with where the sector kind of stands here in DC. I just unfortunately don't think, at least this year, that we're going to see lawmakers take their foot off the gas as it relates to looking into the charitable sector.
Okay. You've already offered a lot of really great advice and resources, but just to wrap us up, is there any more just concrete pieces of advice that you could give to nonprofit leaders who are maybe in crisis mode and not opportunity mode? Any wrap up things that you could say to them?
Yeah, the first I would say is I understand. I understand why some, honestly, most right now feel like we are in a period of crisis. If I can offer any just calming perspective, is that DC moves slowly and there is time to change this narrative and time to engage and to engage thoughtfully. I think that with any work, when you feel like you are in crisis mode, the first thing you want to do is just not engage, especially when it comes to this work, especially when it comes to DC and going to Capitol Hill. You almost want to shy away from the hot topics, right? But I think that it's actually the opposite. I think there's ways to continue the engagement in Washington and to do so thoughtfully. Make sure that your voice is heard on the Hill. And, not every lawmaker and their staff is going to want to hear it, but you never know when you are building a new champion who does want to hear it and who does want to help. And so I think making sure that you've offered your perspective, you've given them the impacts, I think that is better than not. I think it's just how you do it and how you have that conversation, which in right now's political framing can be difficult and challenging. But I think the second is just focusing on your mission, focus on the fact that the nonprofit sector is transparent, already has strong governance, keep your messaging clear, and demonstrate your impact and really tell your story. Not every conversation has to be about a piece of legislation or technical policy. It really can just be as simple as giving an example of the work that you're doing and making sure that folks here in DC understand that through and through, because it's really easy as you sit here in DC and sit in the Capitol to be caught up in all of the conversations. But it's really important to be reminded of the folks back home that lawmakers are representing and how nonprofits are really supporting them.
Great. Thank you. Excellent advice. Ali, thanks so much for being on the show today and sharing your expertise and insights into the challenges, but most importantly, the opportunities that are facing us in the nonprofit world now and in the future. We'll have to have you back sometime as things unfold and just get some more insight from you're a Washington insider. So
yeah, I'd be happy to. Hopefully we'll have even more opportunities than crises to talk about.
I hope so. I look forward to it. I'll keep my glass half full. Thanks for the reminder. I think it's always really helpful. It's easy, like you were saying, to disengage and get scared and go into crisis mode, but challenges are opportunities. Thanks, Ali, for joining us. And as always, if you found today's conversation helpful, share it with your colleagues in the field and contact our SHARP team if you have any questions. Thank you for being a part of the conversation. Until next time, I'm Grant Miller. Thanks for listening. We hope today's discussion gave you practical takeaways to grow your plan giving program. To submit questions and topics for future episodes, go to sharpgroup.org or listen to us on your favorite podcast app. If you found this podcast insightful, be sure to like, review, and subscribe. Until then, stay sharp.